Greetings once again, dear listeners, and thank you for joining us here at the Republic Broadcasting Network. I'm Bruce G. McCarthy, your host for the next 1 hour, and you are listening to Datum Line. In our last Datum Line broadcast, we launched a new economic series entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, for the purpose of addressing the many myths used to justify a centrally planned economy posited on a state and federally licensed monopoly of bank fraud and theft. Since the list of myths is rather long, and because gold and silver have been arch rivals of banking, intangible credit, and legal tender, it seemed appropriate that we open this series by taking aim at a convoluted myth known as the gold standard. Today's message will continue that investigation in the hope that we can dispel the confusion surrounding this myth and so many others. It's this confusion, born of fraud and deceit, that renders modern economics a subject that affects everyone while being understood by virtually no one. To be pitied is that student of modern economics struggling to maintain his or her sanity in today's educational environment. Biblical economic principles, on the other hand, resonate with common sense. The Apostle Paul had these in mind when he wrote to Timothy about good stewardship as it pertains to economics or the science of household management, where he said in 1 Timothy 5:8, "But if any provide not for his own, and especially his own house, that being his kindred, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel." Those ancient principles of the faith to which Paul alluded spoke of just weights and measures, interest or usury, theft, and even warned us to avoid being trapped by debt or credit, the two major components of banking and modern economics. If biblical precepts were as foolish as those of modern economics, they'd be the product of an unrighteous and tyrannical God who commands us to understand the absurd and to do the impossible. Bankers, on the other hand, maneuvered us into a world of perpetual debt after confiscating our lawful money and erecting a system where debt, a sum of money due, is now monetized and called money. To pay off all combined personal, business, and government debt is impossible, since credit is created by bankers without effort, binding a debt-ridden public to repay imaginary loans with interest in labor expended over time on virtually unlimited sums of absolutely nothing. Try as we may, those are impossible odds to beat. But as the Roman civil law maxim says, no one is bound to an impossibility. So then why don't our team of lawyers in Congress invoke this maxim on our behalf? Well, it's because they profit from this system of fraud. Yea, it was Congress who gave birth to the Federal Reserve System, which answers to the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto. As for the victims, who were subjected to public education, the 10th plank, it's hard to awaken and separate them from the myths to which they stubbornly cling. But perhaps by unraveling those myths, we can loosen their grip on the minds of our people. Today's message: Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 2 in our new series. On the other side of our first break, we will address, or summarize at least, some of the topics or points that we raised in the first part of this message. And we will then proceed into one of the books that is very antagonistic to gold and the gold standard, whatever gold standard it is that we're all talking about. Welcome back to this segment of Datum Line, our message today entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, this being part 2 in our new series. In our previous message on the gold standard, we addressed 5 aspects of that myth. 1, that there are no less than 3 different categories of gold standard, there being a gold coin standard, the gold bullion standard, and the gold exchange standard. Second, each of these separate gold standards has many variations thus creating an even wider variety of so-called standards, each of which is and was subject to change. Third, the public was led to believe, erroneously, that the gold standard meant that all notes and certificates could actually claim gold, dollar for dollar, at par, when in fact, normal banking practices never allowed for 100% redemption. 4, thus, we cannot possibly return to a gold standard that never existed, at least the one in the minds of the public. And 5, the United States and other countries were maneuvered carefully through a series of gold coin standards to one or more varieties of gold bullion standard, and then finally to a mysterious and complex gold exchange standard, in which gold is placed offshore, where it is unexchangeable at par, dollar for dollar, as a monetary reserve to redeem any of those credit devices created out of nothing by the banking system. Bankers thus created a massive slave state fueled by 100% credit, the first and only global plantation ever organized in human history. Now, it should be pointed out that each of these 3 basic gold standards that we've mentioned were accompanied by different levels of public access to gold. That is, their gold, or your gold. First, the gold coin standard, as was thought to exist in 1914 when the Federal Reserve opened for business. This was when the gold was in your pocket, or your grandpa's pocket, home, or in the local bank vault, ready to allegedly redeem his, grandpa's, gold certificate, United States note, Federal Reserve bank note, or possibly a national currency note, there being somewhere around 7,000 banks of issue back in those days. Second, a gold bullion standard, which evolved beginning in 1917. Its evolution commenced in 1917 with an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act, when gold, which was held at local banks, could no longer count as reserves for credit expansion. It seems as though the Federal Reserve must have been insinuating that your local bankers were cheats and that they couldn't be trusted. But maybe if they deposited the gold with a Federal Reserve Bank of their district, which is what happened, then the Federal Reserve could verify that the gold really did exist and that the local bank could therefore multiply deposits on that gold. I mean, heck, if you can't trust the Federal Reserve, who could you trust? Redemption was later made available to the club members. You remember the rule, it's their club and you ain't in it? That's the club I'm talking about. As in the United Kingdom after World War I, where there was a 400-ounce minimum on redemption. If you didn't have enough claim checks, enough IOUs to claim 400 ounces of gold, you couldn't get it. In today's dollars, that would amount to somewhere around $750,000. Okay? Third, the latest development was the gold exchange standard. This is where gold is 3 times removed from your grasp, being moved offshore, if you will, in the custody of the most trustworthy, worshipful masters at the International Monetary Fund. That's in order to ensure stability of international trade, you understand. So color that gold gone, erased from public memory. You see, when the small-time thief stole your gold back in the early days, he at least put it back into circulation, so the economy as a whole never lost that gold. When the bankers stole the gold, it was to be lost to the economic situation and circulation forever. Why? So as to make the public totally dependent upon the substitutes for gold and silver, that being intangible credit, which the bankers create out of nothing, in virtually unlimited quantities at no cost to themselves. Okay? Now, England was the first country back in 1821 to officially adopt a monometallic gold standard. Prior to that, it was gold and silver, bimetallic. And this served the bankers well by reducing the supply of money provided by more abundant silver. Prior to World War I, most of the industrialized countries were on a gold coin or gold bullion standard, which were all said to have collapsed during that conflict. Well, why was that? Because the demands of war outstrip immediate monetary reserves of gold when elected officials now turn to the bankers to beg for loans of readily available imaginary bank credit, especially to finance unpopular wars of conquest. You know, it was said about England that the sun never set on the British Empire. The sun never set on the British flag. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. You probably didn't think I was going to sing to you this morning, but I figured I owed that to David Icke and some of our other English cousins over there who are listeners. The alternative to borrowing credit at interest is to win public approval to pay for the war in lawful money and without the interest burden. If the military campaign is just and necessary, then a free people will shoulder that burden. Slaves, on the other hand, will do as they're told. Politicians eager to build global empires on behalf of their corporate cronies avoid public resistance by floating interest-bearing bonds. Why not make war profitable, after all? And then by cranking up the fiat money presses so as to confiscate the needed armaments, manpower, and supplies. A government dependent upon gold and silver coin, produced by independent and free citizens, however, is less likely to engage in empire building for the likes of an East India Company, as did Great Britain centuries ago, or on behalf of Citibank, General Electric, Halliburton, ExxonMobil, and other globetrotters of the CFR, Trilateral Commission, Club of Rome, Bilderberg, and AIPAC-related groups. As World War II drew to a close, the godmen of banking called upon the expertise of economists, like Professor Edwin Kemmerer. You remember, the Walker Professor of International Finance at Princeton University back in the 1930s. They asked him, among others, to devise and justify a gold exchange standard to facilitate the emerging interdependent global economy that would be regulated by the United Nations, which they created in 1945. To soften public resistance to a global government, the Allied forces arrayed against the Japanese, German, and Italian Axis powers were designated as UN forces years earlier, before the United Nations was even foisted upon the American people at the 1945 San Francisco Conference. Good salesmanship is essential to any transformation of the religious, political, and economic landscape, since people are naturally resistant to enforced changes in their habits, circumstances, and lifestyles. The next phase of global economic transformation was discussed in Professor Edwin Kemmerer's later book. I had the first one, 1935, called Money. I think that was his first one. But he later wrote a book called Gold and the Gold Standard, published in 1944. On page 209, Professor Kemmerer begins Chapter 8, entitled The Monetary Standard of the Future. Oh, boy. And this is where he asked, quote, with what sort of a gold standard should the world begin its post-war monetary economy? You see, they're already planning on how things are going to turn out after the war is over. Of course, this was not a rhetorical question, since he was prepared to supply the answer. In point number 3 of his 6 preliminary recommendations, which appeared on page 210, Professor Kemmerer says, quote, everything possible should be done by the government to inspire confidence in the currency, end quote.